So when you have that political economic context where the short-term horizon is very much heavy and really weight heavy in the way people are thinking about natural resources, it becomes complicated even to think about cooperation for them. Because when they think about cooperation, it's going to be, how am I going to win now within the 5 or 10 years of my tenure as president or as prime minister, depending on the country.
Critical raw materials play an increasing role in global geopolitics as the large powers seek to secure the resources they need for advanced manufacturing and green technology. Here in Europe, the Parliament recently passed the Critical Raw Materials Act, which it describes as essential to enabling Europe to meet its 2030 climate and digital objectives. Brussels has also just hosted an EU-funded raw materials conference, among criticism that much more needs to be done to secure Europe's future. Similar, if not greater, efforts are underway in the US and, especially, China. This has huge implications for the developing countries in which most of these critical raw materials are found, not least in Africa, where global powers compete for access. I am Jonathan Hunter of ECDPM, and I'm joined by Poorva Karkare, our specialist on industrialisation and regional integration in Africa, who will introduce us to critical raw materials and their growing importance to both the continent and the powers vying for access to its resources. Later, Poorva interviews Christian Géraud Neema Biamungu, editor of the China Global South Project and an analyst of China-Africa relations, with a particular focus on natural resources.
Hello.
When we say critical raw materials or CRMs, what exactly are we talking about?
So critical raw materials includes many minerals. They are basically minerals. So you have lithium, cobalt, manganese, graphite, and say the EU, the US, China, all of them have their own CRM lists, which there's a lot of overlap, but they're not exactly the same. And the reason you would talk about CRMs is because these are minerals that are important for national security and economic development of the country, but they are also highly susceptible to supply chain disruptions. And I think because of COVID, there were these lessons drawn that you cannot depend on one country, and that one country in this case is China, because China really has a dominance on these supply chains. And with Russia happening, there's also a lesson being drawn that that over-dependence can very easily be weaponized. So there's a lot of move in many of these partners, be it the US, the EU, India, Turkey, to also try and diversify these supply chains. And it makes sense now, not only from an economic sense, because depending on one country is just not worth it, but also from a geopolitical sense. And that's why you're also talking about things like friendshoring or reshoring.
And when we say critical and critical raw materials, who are they critical to exactly?
That's an excellent question, because I think if you ask African countries, for instance, there is some pushback on this, where they are saying these are not critical for us, but they're more strategic for us. And that feeling or that ambition is coming from a place of also wanting to develop these supply chains and value chains and participate in them by adding more value in those countries. So it's also a pushback against sort of the West coming in or even China for that matter, coming in and saying, right, these are critical for us, so we're going to take your minerals. Thank you very much. They're trying to push back on that and saying, that's not what we want. We want something else. So they are calling it strategic.
So is it fair to say that there's two main kind of ways of looking at this? On the one hand, we have critical raw materials and all of the countries that are looking to use these raw materials or secure these raw materials or have a kind of at least reliable access to these raw materials for their own economic and industrial needs. And on the other hand, there's the mostly developing countries who have these raw materials and the strategies they might take, both in terms of who they partner with, but also whether they want to use them themselves.
Absolutely. And there, I think the only complicating factor, if you would call it so, would be that while this geopolitical competition is playing out, let's say between US, China, EU, you name it, one really has to wonder how much focus there is in trying to look at the long-term development needs of these developing countries vis-a-vis the short-term needs to secure these minerals for green and digital transition back home. And on the flip side, there's also a question of just how much space and room or even capacity these African countries, but also other low income countries or least developed countries really have in playing diplomacy and trying to sort of navigate this great power competition.
So our guest today is Christian Géraud Neema Biamungu. I'm interested in how he fits into this discussion and what kind of insight we can get from him.
So I have been following some of Christian's work. He knows the mining sector, so he can really distill some of these political announcements from what is happening in practice, just as I alluded to before. And as a follower, really a close follower of China-Africa relations, being an African himself, speaking Chinese as well, and following some of the developments that are happening in other external partner countries, so be it the US or the EU, I think he can really give a sense of not just how in the West we see Chinese engagements in Africa are, but really giving a sense of how African countries look at Chinese engagements in their own countries and how they are looking at this whole angle of geopolitical competition. Because a lot of the times, I think most of the analysis that at least we consume here are written by a certain group of people with an entry point that looks from the EU into Africa. But we also need to understand how things are being seen from Africa looking towards the EU or towards China. And I think he would be the right person to bring in this kind of perspective.
Okay, so without further ado, let's listen to the interview with Géraud.
Welcome, Géraud. Maybe we can start by you telling us briefly about yourself.
So my name is Christian Géraud Neema. I'm the Francophone and Africa editor of the China Global South project, which is an online media that covers China engagement and involvement in the Global South. We started as covering China in Africa. We were called before China in Africa project. We became China in Global South because we wanted to understand China engagement in large, what China does in all part in the Global South, because we come to understand that China engagement in the Global South are not isolated events. They're much more part of a much more larger comprehensive strategy. So to understand what China does, one part you need to understand also to read out on what they do on the other part. As myself, I'm also a non-resident senior associate for the CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies at Washington, D.C. And on both capacities, my focus is on China, Africa, and especially when it comes to natural resources. I'm an expert on the geopolitical of natural resources. I've worked in the mining sectors in the DRC for quite some time, and I had the opportunity to work with Chinese company. It was really not really at the early, but it was early 2010 to 2011 when there were really that rush in the DRC when it comes to mining sector, buying natural resources. At that time, many Chinese were really into buying those natural resources from the DRC. And myself, I've studied and lived in China for 10 years, so I had the opportunity to create those business opportunities with them. And later on, when I came back to DRC, working with them on the ground, it was really a hands-on experience on both the Chinese mentality, the way they approach mining sectors in DRC, the way they do business in DRC, and also the way DRC does business itself when it comes to mining industry. And I also had opportunity later on to work with civil society on everything related to transparency, good governance on not only the mining industry, but at the large when it comes to governance at the local level.
Thank you very much. So basically, you're representing everyone that one would think of when we sit around the table, right? You have civil society, you have private sector, you also have the ones looking at it from a geopolitical angle. So you're kind of the perfect guest to be talking about these things. So maybe to begin with, I would like to start with African ambitions. So Africa obviously is home to many of these CRMs, right? Whether we talk about lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, you name it. And they want to take advantage of the rising demand for these minerals. So could you start by telling us a bit what some of the measures are that countries or regions in Africa are putting in place to take advantage of these
I
minerals?
think I might be a bit critical of that word of African ambition because I've said it before in different discussion I had with people on the ground and different experts and also colleagues when we talk about that. I say it's really difficult to talk about African ambitions because when you look at all African producing countries, none of them has a critical mineral policy. You have the US has one, you have the EU has one, Japan has one, China has one. Many developed countries that are looking into Africa in terms of extracting, in terms of importing natural resources from them, they do have. But when you look at Africa, they don't. Africa doesn't have the DRC, Zambia, Angola, Namibia. They don't have those critical minerals policies. Of course, now they're expressing what willingness to what they call the willingness to move up into the value chain of those natural resources. To build processing refineries, and the DRC is even talking about building, being able to produce EV batteries on the ground. But that's not. I won't really call it an ambition per se. As I say, I'm gonna be really critical. I might. I call it much more a bandwagoning ambition in a certain sense because today they only call those CRMs, they only define them as CRM because of what the global north wants, because the demand in the global north, because of the demand of the EV industry, because of the demand of the defense industry in the US and Europe. But when you go in the DRC, you go in Zambia, you go in all those countries, you ask them, why do you believe that cobalt is a critical raw material for you? Most of them will tell you just because the EV industry. But you say beyond the EV industry, don't you have yourself your own industrial economic policy strategy? So yes, without that simple policy that's quite important, I don't really believe that we can say they have ambition.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you with the whole bandwagoning argument, right? I mean, I was reading somewhere in one of the World Bank reports that, I mean, why do countries want to get a better position in the global value chain for these minerals as well? It's to get more state revenues, among other things, right? But the point is that state revenues and processing, so when you're talking about value addition, it's also for countries to realize that all these even economic objectives don't necessarily work in the same direction. So if DRC wanted to go into copper manufacturing, you are talking about an industry of maybe 500 million in terms of the overall revenue of the whole industry, which will then be equivalent to at least 100 million or more in export revenues, create about 2,000 jobs, all of it very nice. But then when you're talking about state revenues, you're only talking about maybe 9 million, that extra state revenues that are going to be generated, because this value addition, even if it happens, the actual margins in this industry are so tiny. So that's not going to create much in terms of state coffers. And so in a situation or a context in the DRC, for instance, where natural resource exports make up more than 90% of the export revenues, they're about 25% of the state revenues, and create so much employment, how are we, not we, but like it's just very difficult to convince the government that they should forego in the short term export revenues by taxing copper so that other companies can actually add value to it in the DRC itself, and then maybe in the future they can collect more taxes. But anyway, I mean, that was just within the country, right? That brings me kind of to my next question, which is, if you're talking about the AFCFTA, where they're also talking about regional value chains, and the reason you would talk about regional value chains is that even if we talk about batteries, the minerals that are required for batteries are dispersed across several different countries. So it doesn't make sense for one country to work on it. So you have to work in a regional value chain. That's the basic definition of it. So while this might be true, in practice, in theory, this makes sense. In practice, you always have this kind of tension between cooperation and competition when it comes to different countries working together. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that, based on your experience or some other things that you have come across, where some of the challenges lie.
It's to understand that issue, that dynamic of cooperation and rivalry even within regional countries. You really have to understand the political economy and the background on how each country sees the mining industry in its own mining industry. When you perceive and when you see the mining industry as the main source of your revenue, and that's the revenue that you use to create your political network, to reinforce your political party, or you reinforce your regime and everything, you, of course, you always driven by short-term goal. You always driven by revenue that's going to allow you to reinforce and to strengthen your power within 5 years or within 10 years, because with the term limits and everything, you always have that short-term vision on how things are going. So in that regard, where everything that comes with a plan that goes beyond your own presidential term are becoming quite difficult for a leader to grasp and say, let's put a place in strategy that's going to benefit the country without benefiting me when I won't even be president. And this is something quite difficult to convince many African leaders to do, especially in those countries where they have their rich natural resources. Nature has made that they're also very politically unstable. Those countries where you have good governance is very shaky. So those are the countries where you realize that people that don't really see things on the long term. So when you have that political economic context where the short-term horizon is very much heavy and really weight heavy in the way people are thinking about natural resources, it becomes complicated even to think about cooperation for them. Because when they think about cooperation, it's going to be, how am I going to win now within the 5 or 10 years of my tenure as president or as prime minister, depending on the country. That's even explained why, for example, the DRC and Zambia are still bickering about where they're going to build the special economic zone for EV batteries. Both of them are telling you the same thing. It was really funny. One of them was telling me, no, no, no. DRC, we are well placed. This is the place where that EV industry should be built. We have the space, we have the energy, we have everything. And when he say have energy, I was telling him, but a lot of energy supply from mining industry in Kolwezi are coming from Zambia. And you say, no, 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 that's a short-term problem. But we have here the potential. And plus, we are the one producing the cobalt. How do you explain that we're gonna have to build it in Zambia because it's more stable there? And you talk to Zambia and they say, we have much more stability here. We have also electricity, we have political stability. And you tell them, but guys, a lot of copper industries have been shutting down because of your electricity supply is not up to par, up to standard. And they gave you pretty much the same argument in the DRC. But even you tell them that DRC producing much more cobalt, much more copper, and it makes sense to build there. But the response that you get is always that response of saying that no, 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 it's better here. They don't tell you straightforward, but you understand their fear. You understand that for them it's like, what am I losing now? Because how a president is going to explain to his population that we are pulling resources, but the cost of the resources of that strategy is going to be on the neighboring countries.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think in all of this, we're still talking about what's happening in Africa, right? But the whole point, of course, is that Africa doesn't operate in a vacuum. And you have the US, the EU, China, all of them, and other players as well. Name it, Turkey, Saudi, India. So, Géraud, one of the things that we also hear is that when it comes to African countries, they also work much closer with Chinese counterparts, especially in mining, right? So one of the questions would also be, what is it about China that really attracts African countries, or why does China have that upper hand compared to other partners?
The answer I get from for decision makers in different countries in the region, they tell you China was willing to come when everyone else was not willing to come. In the DRC, they will tell you we had American companies here, but because of the political landscape, they say they sold their project, they sold it to Chinese. Chinese were willing to come when everybody was saying it's a bad economic, those countries are bad governance, corruption, and everything. That's why China came. And the why China had the upper end, because shielded from the reputational damage that many European countries or even Western countries would going to face in the DRC, or if not in the DRC, in many of those countries, where a civil society in Europe and Brussels just release a report. Glencore has done this and done that. It's over. It's done. You have protests on the street. You have calling. You have the media talking about you. But you won't have the same criticism from coming any civil society from China. So any companies, when they come, they say, this is how the game is played. As we say, in Rome, you dance like Romans. So if this is how you do business in DRC, we're gonna do that. But even that, I was talking to some executive. They say the Chinese, they made the situation worse. We know that in DRC we are corrupted, but the way the Chinese were willing to put money on the table just made the situation so much worse than it was before. And this is very interesting. This is what I say. And he said that's why I would like to see much more European company coming, because at least with them we can have a certain healthy business environment. And this is that thing that you feel a lot among many mining executive Congolese mining executives. They say it's different. Having other stakeholders allows you to have much more a better leverage even when you negotiate with Chinese, because this is the reality as well. When you only have Chinese, when you negotiate with Chinese companies, they do know that you don't have any other options. They do know that you cannot go anywhere. They're the only ones on the ground. But when other players are coming in, you are feeling much more safe and say, okay, I can say no to you because now I have Aramets, now I have Baft, now I have Glencore, now I have this and that, I have Anglo Gold who can come and everything. That's why people are saying, yeah, let's welcome the Chinese coming. Let's welcome all the stakeholders coming into the fold. That's going to allow us to have much more, to have a better leverage when you negotiate with Chinese. But just keep in mind, even when they do that, they don't want to get rid of the Chinese companies, because on their own word, they say the Chinese, they understand us better. They do business the way we want to do business.
I was also wondering how these external players are trying to balance their imperative to extract resources from Africa for growth back home in their country vis-a-vis the increased demands from from the African side for greater domestic processing.
Yes, it's for them. It's an opportunity for many of those countries. For example, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and everything, and all those new countries. It's very an opportunity for them because they're coming in a moment where countries like not much of Zimbabwe, much country like the DRC, Zambia, Tanzania, Namibia, Mozambique, they want to have a diversification in the mining industry. I think I would divide two kind of sets of countries. You have the, let's say, the democratic countries, the country from G7, European countries, and country from Japan, for instance, the US and everything. They want to come, but they have to face the reality of, beyond the demand of what local government are asking, they have to face the reality of good governance on the ground. How do you come in those countries where corruption and instability and there is a very bad business environment? How do we go there? How do we convince our private sector? Because many of those countries, especially in the G7, they do not, and the European countries, they do not have state-owned mining companies that can compel to follow them and to follow through with their strategies. So on the other side, you have those countries are not I won't say not democratic, but country like UAE or Saudi Arabia and all those countries and Qatar, they can deal with places where political instability, corruptions are happening because they don't really get involved on how you manage your country. So those countries, just like China, might have much more opportunity to be present in that space. And of course, when you have country now opening up and say we want new project, we want new players, we might see more country like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE being coming forth and being more present than country for democratic countries, G7, EU. So now the question is, how do they address the demand of local government, of local processing and and local processing and refining? So far, we're gonna have to see what they put on the ground, because despite the big talk, they still have to prove themselves that they can do it. We've seen a Dubai company in the in eastern part of the DRC signing a deal where they say, we're going to be refining gold in the east of the DRC, because the gold that produced from the eastern of DRC is going to Dubai. We're going to refine it here in the DRC. But they're producing much more gold, buying from different artisanal miners, but they're still processing it in Dubai, not in the DRC, because the local context making things much more difficult for them.
Right? Like these are the views of external players as they are looking into Africa. But the other way around is just as important, right? What African countries and leaders are thinking as they look towards these different actors. And you already alluded to just the presence of having more players also means that you are mitigating your risks in certain ways. But are there any other points that you can think of? I mean, what is really the room for maneuver, or the room for these African countries to really leverage even this angle of geopolitical competition that's happening between players?
There was a moment in the case of the DRC. There was a moment in early 2019 when President Tshisekedi took power. He took power in a very contested election, and people were not really happy about it. So to make friends with the US, he really started to move forward into revising Chinese contract. It became really much more vocal about what China is doing in the DRC. And you would be talking with people in his circle. They say, no, we need to show the US that we are open for business. We are not only China oriented and everything. And soon, and you quite realize that it was much more for a personal gain that strategy was put in place. It was like more, we want to show the US that, we want to attract the US, that China is not really what we thought China was and everything. So for early to 2019, 2010, 2011, President Tshisekedi was really pushing toward the US and revising all those contracts because he had his own internal political agenda. But when he saw that it did not come out, it did not produce what he was expecting in terms of political support, in terms of full American, a lot of American company investment coming in, he kind of backtracked and went back to China. That's why even the revised contract he signed for the Sikomin deal or even for TFM was really subpar. It was really below standards. Like, no, after everything that you said, you couldn't sign this kind of contract. But you kind of realize that he said that I cannot really count on the US because what I was expecting, I did not get it from them. And especially now when they're now facing the instability in the eastern part of the DRC, the US being vocal about what's happening there, but the US does not react the way they expect the US to react. So they say, we better turn to China because, and later on China selling them drones and everything. They say China remains still our closest partner. So that's why they try to really to play the both sides because they had their own political internal agenda. And one other thing that I'm going to mention, because I think it's really in that segment. 6 months ago, the EU and the DRC signed a MOU about critical raw material. It was about to say, like, within 6 months, we are going to have a plan to come and say, this is how we're going to implement that MOU. 6 months, nothing has been done. And when you talk with different stakeholders in the DRC and even in EU, you get now the feeling of like, what's happening? They say, we were not happy about the MOU that the EU signed with Rwanda. And you kind of like, but you get that MOU is a similar MOU that signed with the DRC and Zambia. No, but we are not happy how the EU can sign a MOU about raw material with a country like Rwanda that's feeding the war in the east of the DRC, and we know that Rwanda is playing a major role into that spot. So they really got mad, and that's where you see that a regional agenda became a problem for the EU to materialize the MOU they signed with the DRC, because the DRC cannot understand that you are signing an MOU with me, we are also signing a similar MOU with another country I'm at war with about the same natural resources. So it became much more complicated. So that's where you see even local politics and regional politics are becoming an issue on how the EU, for example, is going to tackle. How do we explain that we are going to work with Rwanda and the DRC in the same space of critical material, knowing that two countries are fighting together?
No, indeed. And I mean, here we also get into the realm of security and regional conflict, where the Great Lakes region is one of the most complex and complicated. Leaving that conversation aside, maybe to start winding up our discussion, what would be for you some of the implications, or in order to understand what's happening in practice? And if we start with like sort of this reality check, looking at what's happening in Africa, are there any other things that you would like to mention here in terms of doing a reality check?
In the absolute sense, I would say that cooperation and regional approach is not a must in the absolute sense. It's not a must in the sense where if a country has all the resources that required, energy supply, political stability, economic market, industrial landscape, a country can do it by itself. That's not a debate. It's becoming a problem in Africa in our cases because each country has problems that they cannot find solution by its own. And this is where you see that there is a need of pooling resources in terms of market accessibility, in terms of electricity supply, in terms of like political landscape, in terms of so many resources that we can they can pool resources to build strategy, especially and I'm going to emphasize on that, especially when you do have in the case of, since China is the major player, you have the same Chinese company operating in DRC, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Namibia. When they negotiate with different countries, the companies has a overall strategy, knowing that I know how I'm putting my pieces on the board. But those individual countries, they're negotiating as individual entities. Of course, they have the right to do so, but they don't have the overall strategy the way the company is seeing the region. And this is becoming a problem. That's why we're saying that pulling resources together, working together in that sense, going to allow them, help them to be able to better strategize and to really compensate for each other's difficulties, each other each other's shortcomings. So, in the case of the EFTA, beyond the electricity supply, it's also the market accessibility, because it's one thing producing EV batteries in the DRC, but when you don't have a EV market in the DRC, where do you go? You're gonna have to have a market either in South Africa, either in Nigeria, either in country like Morocco. You have to be able to say, okay, the EV batteries I'm producing in DRC and Zambia are going to be sold to car makers in Morocco or in Nigeria or in South Africa and so or in Egypt, in those different countries. This is the strategy I have to put in place. How do we put all those elements together in the whole supply chain, not only to limit processing and refining, but also into the market? How do you create a market for that? So far, we don't have strong market. We don't have strong demand for that. I was talking to a Chinese mining executive. He was telling me, you know, people are telling us once you do cobalt sulfate here, who's going to buy it here? We have no buyers here. We're going to have to sell it back to China, refining there and selling back here. If we do the same in Zimbabwe, same thing. Who's going to buy it here? Because there is no market.
Indeed, I do think that market access is very, very important. And also thinking in terms of demand, what you were saying exactly. Even if cobalt sulfate were produced tomorrow, who is going to buy it? But I think this is also where the formal political commitments also come in the way, right? Like right now, the whole rhetoric is around regional integration and Africa working as one. And that also, no one's going to say we don't have to be doing that. So there's also political economy factors there.
Exactly, yeah. They have short-term goals. That's the problem. They have really short-term goals and short-term vision, and I think that's the big problem for them.
I mean, more than short term, it's probably even political rhetoric, which doesn't quite match the reality on the ground.
Exactly, yeah.
Moving on, then my big question to you before before we part ways today would be, when looking at external partners and focusing especially on the EU, because that's, I think, most of our audience are probably also going to be here. What would your reality check be to this ambition or quest to de-risk supply chains from China?
My reality check for them would be they have to be aware of their own limitation first. The reality is they want to de-risk from China, I understand. But do they have the industrial landscape today to process cobalt coming from the DRC? When you look at the processing map of the world, you see the big red dot in China everywhere, the whole big heavy industry. When you go to Europe, you see Yumiko, you see another one up there, but you don't see a lot of them. You don't see a lot of heavy industry. Unless they really start to change the industrial landscape to say we're now going to process those miners at home in EU, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So for me will be, you have to take into account that you might in the short term needs to work with Chinese company to a certain extent. You might need to do that because the problem, they're mixing both security and economic agenda in the same basket. The security agenda is telling them, no, China, we cannot do that. We cannot be putting our eggs in China. It's too much risky. But the economic agenda is telling them, guys, you cannot do without China. If you fail economically, your security agenda is also failing. So they might need, on a very short term, mid-term, being able to say, how do you create positive, good synergies with Chinese stakeholders that are present on the ground to allow us to keep on having access to those critical minerals. First point. Second point, the solution might be as well to say we need to strengthen the industrial capacity of those producing countries, allowing them to refine and transform cobalt and lithium and manganese and phosphate and graphite and everything to the level where when they're processing it, us in Europe, we can buy from them and then do the last step of processing and enrichment. So which means that we have to find a way, for example, as European countries, how do we invest heavily in those countries in terms of processing and refining? And the question, and I understand, I can hear my European friends telling, but your countries are unstable. Your countries are politically unstable. There's too much corruption. And this is the problem for them. And this is now the reality check for them. And I think for them, they're going to have to find punctual solution, very short-term solution. Say, for example, let's say, how are we going to strengthen the capacity of a stand company like the Gécamin in the DRC. We can work with Gécamin only, give it much more ability to enforce its geological and prospection and finding new deposits and building new refining and allow it to really processing to the point where we can buy straight from Gécamin instead of buying from Chinese company under the ground. So they're gonna have to find different solutions that are not going to entail them to go into a state building capacity, because the reality of good governance are state building issues that take long term. And I understand they don't have that long term they don't have that long term. They have really urgent needs. So for me, the reality check, they need to balance the political rhetoric of like no China with the economic reality of like, how do we create positive synergies with Chinese stakeholders on the ground? And to finish on that, it's not impossible, because the reality also is you have a lot of European companies working with Chinese company elsewhere in Latin America, in Asia. So it's not impossible for that to happen in countries like in Africa. So it can really be done. So I think they should be open to that idea and maybe tone a bit down the geopolitical rhetoric, because it's going to play against them.
Wow. Really, lots to learn on both sides, I see. And I think the common message on both sides seems to be distill sort of the political rhetoric from economic and socio-cultural realities as well. We could go on for hours, but unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Géraud, thank you so much for joining us and really appreciate your time. And thanks also to our listeners for tuning in.
Thank you, Poorva, for having me. It was a pleasure.